Hello, I'm back again. I'm reading Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester. And in this chapter, it's chapter 8. It's kind of a long chapter discussing her time in Kenya. The title is called Lions in Kenya. It's quite a long chapter, so I may break this up into two parts, but just want to share you this picture. This is one of her cars. This is why they needed those Citroen cars with chains on them, because here she's stuck in a road. And that was how it was in the 1930s in Africa back then. I mean, traveling those roads. But this was quite a time in her life to be spending time in Africa before she became married to Prince Henry, who was the Duchess Duke, who was the son of George V, and it's quite an experience to have these adventures before you get married, especially when you marry into the royal family. But I'll go ahead and get started. I stayed on for over a year. Kenya was a wonderful period of freedom for me. It was a remarkable relief to be able to do and wear more or less exactly what I liked. I reveled in being able to dress informally most of the time, in trousers, mosquito boots, and cotton check shirts, and be at a farm one minute and off in my car on some adventures the next. I suppose I was kind of a pre-beatnik, but I also thrived on the responsibility. Responsibility not just for myself, but also an important extent to an important extent, my uncle and aunt. As Aunt Eileen was first ill and then absent in England, putting the children into boarding school, I was left to look after Uncle Francis. And since he, too, was frequently in Nairobi on government business, I was also often the ultimate authority in the day-to-day running at Deloraine as well. I have never been happier and look back at this episode in my life as the greatest possible piece of good fortune. It was sad to say goodbye to Mary. We had such good fun together, laughing about all the odd things that seemed perpetually to happen. What with our visits to Nairobi and two kind settlers who had invited us to look in on them, I had by then made many acquaintances. Polo at Najora was sometimes 15 miles away and was a popular excuse for people to foregather on a Sunday, and teams would arrive from quite a distance away. Uncle Francis was a keen player, and in spite of his badly wounded leg, he was a very good player. I made many friends and happily accepted mounts of hunting and gymkhanas. The atmosphere was delightfully happy go lucky. A man who lived about 25 miles from the polo ground would unharness his ponies after a march and give them a smack and trust them to find their own way at home. One rather boring young man turned up regularly at these events and kept asking me to visit his farm. After making After my making one excuse after the other, he eventually said he was organizing a tennis tournament and hoped I would take part in it. Being fond of the game and quite a good player, I thought it would be fun and accepted. When the day arrived, I set off with a racket and shoes, telling my aunt not to worry if I did not return till after dark. My tiresome friend greeted me warmly, and I looked around for the other players and their cars, but there was no sign of either. "Oh dear, have I arrived too early?" I asked politely. Looking rather embarrassed, he said no one else was coming and that actually he had not got a tennis court. I could not help laughing as it was such a silly situation. He offered to show me around the farm, to which I said no thanks, but suggested that some lunch would be appreciated if he had any. After that, I took my departure, agreeing with those who had told me that some rather odd people lived in Kenya. Meanwhile, my uncle, arriving back in Deloraine, had asked where I was. When my aunt told him, he flew into a rage and said, "But the damn fellow hasn't got any tennis court." I heard later that when he next met the unfortunate man, he told him what he thought of him. That summer, I made another visit to the Ridleys at Capsalat, this time for the local race meeting and gymkhana. Capsalat was one of the happiest and most beautiful of all homesteads. The Ridleys had started from scratch and searched the country for a beautiful spot, cutting down the bush and building the long, rambling house bit by bit over the years. It was surrounded by lovely gardens and lawns, with a few large and beautiful trees dotted around, a fast flowing river full of trout half a mile away, and in later years there was a dam which made a lovely lake and also full of trout. In the distance were forests of cedar trees, and beyond that the Charangani Hills, home of the ghostly Nandi bear. Strange and terrifying, this beast had only been seen after dark and greatly feared by the natives. Mervyn Ridley had polo ponies and race horses, both at his guest's disposal to use as hacks for early morning rides before breakfast. The whole house party would get up at 6:30, choose their mount, and set off in whatever direction they preferred. What could be more enjoyable? Mervyn and Sybil were the greatest friends of my uncle and aunt, and of myself also, and it was a sad day when this happy home had to be handed back to the Africans. Luckily, the Ridleys had died by then. My cousin Pamela Scott, who lives in Kenya, went up to the Capsulat not long ago to look at their graves. The house was falling down, the trees cut down by people who did not realize that there were no trees there, but that with no trees there will come no rain, and just a few underfed cattle were left to search for food in the scrub all around. Alas, such is the fate of so many loved and beautiful homes. I cannot help feeling that those European owners had a far deeper affection for the country than for the Africans today, who, for the most part, have had no knowledge of anywhere else and just take it all for granted. Later that summer, I went to an indifferent part of Kenya to stay for a few enjoyable weeks in a banda just south of Mombasa. A low tide, the coral reef stretched quite a distance, and one could wander about looking into little pools filled with small, brightly colored fish. There were few people, and the only buildings were the 3 or 4 open-sided bandas. It is now a popular holiday resort, and houses stretch for miles both to the south and up beyond Mombasa Island to the north. The most famous inhabitant at that time was a 100-year-old tortoise. Everyone going to the Mombasa would have looked at it and be photographed sitting in its back. I read some years later that it had died. Apparently, it went to get some shade beneath a large lorry and was crushed to death when the driver resumed his journey. I have that in one of my video clips of, let's see if I can find it, that tortoise. Anyway, it's in the video clip of her sitting. See, there you go. You see that? That's her. That's her sitting on the tortoise. Everybody, I guess, had to get a picture with that tortoise. So, after we returned up country, we began preparations for a long safari through Tanganyika. Uncle Francis, together with Mervyn Ridley and others, owned a coffee plantation in the far south of the country on the borders of Nyasaland. We set off from Nairobi, where he had joined forces with the Ridleys and each in our own car, and the African servants with tents and provisions in the lorry. The roads were even worse than those in Kenya, and the rivers all had to be forded except the Rawa, which was too large and deep to be waded, accordingly boasted a bridge. The engine of the lorry broke down halfway through the journey, and it had to be towed by me because my car was considered the most suitable for the job. The first day of the exhibition had taken us across the Serengeti Plain, today perhaps the world's most famous game reserve. It teemed with animals of all sorts, which did not seem unduly worried by our procession of cars and hardly bothered to look at. They hardly bothered to look at us. Before crossing a district known as the Mubeji Flats, we were stopped and the cars were sprayed to rid them of any tsetse fly, so as to prevent us carrying infection of the dreaded sleepy sickness into that part of the country. The inhabitants of the flats lived with their animals in a large square. Deeply dug out houses with thatched roofs being only about 2 feet above ground, we paid a call on one of these strange, virtually subterranean dwellings. The owners were most friendly and kindly offered us a drink of goat's milk out of a cow's horn. We would not refuse and just managed to get down a mouthful, luckily with no disastrous after effects. At another place, I strayed away from our shady picnic spot and walked out of the bush into a village. The inhabitants took a horrific look at me and fled as one into the safety of their huts. It may well have been that they had never set eyes on a white person before, and though I was a leper or a ghost, and they might have thought I was a leper or a ghost. I hastily withdrew to put their minds at ease. Even in this remote part of the world, we managed to contact a friend from the borders, Billy Usher, whom I'd known since childhood. He bought land near Tabora, and his farm was doing well. He had arranged beforehand to meet at the local hotel. He asked if he could join us at our next camp near another farm in which Mervyn had an interest, and offered to drive me in his lorry to give my car a rest till we turned up again to Tabora in 2 days' time. To my dismay, his lorry broke down, but by fault or design, I was never quite sure. Luckily, after a while, it had got going again, and we joined up with the rest of the party well after midnight to find a very agitated uncle and aunt waiting for us. We eventually reached the coffee plantation and had a relatively uneventful return trip. I managed to do quite a number of watercolor sketches during this expedition, which I am so glad to remind me of it all. In Tanzania, I was shown some beautiful life-size paintings of wild animals on the walls of the town hall. They were by a famous German animal painter who had been quartered there during the First World War. A few years ago, at a state dinner for Nair, the president of Tanzania, I asked my Tanzanian neighbor if he could ever see them. He expressed great surprise and said he had never heard of them, so maybe they were devoured by ants long ago. Soon after our return to Kenya, we attended a farewell dinner in Nairobi for the governor and Joni Grigg, who'd been so hospitable to Mary and me, and then traveled north again to help organize the first visit by a group of English schoolboys to the colony. The party of boys, about 12 in number, were put up by various families around about. The Deloraine we had the master in charge, who happened to be the son of the Dean of Windsor, and two of his pupils. When writing his name in the visitor's book at the end of his stay, the master rather pompously wrote, Windsor Castle at his address. Much of his subsequent annoyance of the boys, who quite rightly considered him something of a snob, added the initials SS in front of it. By this time, I made many friends and traveling around to visit them on their farms, in some cases to get some hunting, often just to lend a helpful hand. My uncle had a racehorse which he allowed me to exercise every morning. His trainer, C.B. Clutterbuck, another well known local character, widely referred to as Clut, had galloped about 7 miles from the Deloraine, and I often used to ride over there to join in, invariably staying out afterwards to eat a hearty breakfast. There were 3 packs of hounds, one at Molo, only 12 miles from Deloraine, another in Wanjoey, Happy Valley, and the third up yet in Nyeri. It was Molo. I went most often. I had many friends there who were always willing to lend me a polo pony. It was a lovely country. It was rather similar to Wiltshire Downs, with rolling grass covered hills and valleys. The altitude was 9,000 feet, and few Africans lived there because they found it too cold at night. The long, flat, happy valley at the end of the Aberdare range of mountains was very different. There one galloped over rough scrub rocks and pig holes, a rather alarming experience, particularly as one knew there could be a lion lurking in the bushes. On one occasion, I left the hunt to return home, realizing that both I and the pony were too tired to go on. Passing a thick clump of bushes, my mount gave a terrified snort and burst into an uncontrollable gallop. I presume it had smelled a lion, an animal of which all horses seem to have an instinctive fear. Once, when staying in the valley, I joined some of the farmers in a hunt for a lion that had been killing cattle and frightening the natives. The party split in two, and I and one other member staying near our camp, while the rest went farther afield. After this group had appeared, a magnificent old lion stepped out of a cluster of bushes and stood looking in the direction they had gone. We shouted to try to call them back, but to no avail, so in the end, we decided that on the count of 3, we would both have a shot at it ourselves. We fired, and the beast, obviously hit, staggered off into the nearby forest. The other party, hearing our shots, eventually returned, but it was decided to leave the animal for the time being and wait till the following day before hazarding a search. Accordingly, at dawn, we set off again, this time in line abreast. Unfortunately, a light rain overnight had washed away any tracks there might have been. I crept along a vague path and suddenly, to my horror, noticed that my hand was covered in sticky blood. Wiping it off, I expected to find some nasty bite on my hand, but there was nothing to be seen. I then recollected that I just pushed my way underneath a low branch and might have collected the blood by brushing against it. In other words, the wounded lion might be close at hand. I retraced my steps, and sure enough, the lower parts of the branch were covered with gore from where a bleeding animal had pushed underneath it. We never found the lion, but no more cattle were subsequently eaten. I tell you, this Alice, she was made of sturdy stock. I mean, I would never have shot at the lion had I not thought it might have been a cattle eater. Contrary to popular legend, there was not an excessive amount of game shooting in Kenya, especially by the white people who actually lived there. The original English settlers, the Lord Delamere and Mervyn Ridley, initially came to shoot. It is true, but they stayed to farm, and so did their successors. They treasured the animals and grew to be very anti shooting. They might go out with a gun to protect their crops or livestock or get something for the pot or the dogs, but they heartily despised the trophy shooting of the big game hunters. Kenya may have been regarded as a den of iniquity, but the settlers on the whole were good and worthy people. It was just a few who used it as a bolt hole to escape their creditors that gave it a bad name. The most extensive landowner was Lord Delamere, renowned for his unique distinction of being a blood brother of the Maasai. Another legendary figure was Ewart Grogan, who had walked from Cairo to the Cape in order to persuade the girl he loved to marry him. And she did. Both these formidable characters took a leading part in the political life and welfare of the country. Much gossip surrounded the settlers of Happy Valley, many of whom, however, were most respectable and serious farmers. Perhaps the most colorful of the settlers at the date were Boy and Genesee Long, who set off their good looks with the most beautifully cut and carefully chosen clothes. Boy, invariably sporting riding boots and a very dashing sombrero trimmed with snakeskin, they had a magnificent estate overlooking Lake Nakora. Now it's an attractive game park. Here I met Evelyn Waugh, who had just arrived from the coronation of Haile Selassie, where Prince Henry had been, representing King George V. Although only in Kenya a few days, Waugh had already succeeded in making himself a very unpopular. He seemed to take a malicious pleasure in irritating people. One evening we had a picnic dinner. When the moon came out, he put on a very conspicuous hat and announced, "I'm told the Kenya moon is dangerous and makes people decidedly odd. I think I better keep my hat on." During our stay, the Longs and their near neighbors suffered a great deal of damage from a huge grass fire. From the house, we watched this inferno rage in the darkness. Although a beautiful and awe-inspiring sight, to many of the party it represented the loss of their most precious pastures. So its beauty was not for them a matter of first concern. But Evelyn Waugh would not stop. "Oh, what a wonderful sight," he kept explaining. "Isn't it magnificent?" The stony lack of response to his enthusiasm only spurred him to great extravagance. It was all done on purpose to get a reaction, of course. A character who was undeniably responsible for giving Kenya some of its reputation was Raymond de Trafford, a remarkable individual who was known to most people as Borstal Boy. He suffered the indignity of being shot by his wife. Before I left for Africa, everybody said, "Beware of the Borstal Boy. Be sure to lock your door if he's around." I never thought of it any more about this until one night, when staying with friends, a car drove up unexpectedly and in he walked. Having been waylaid by a sudden deluge, he was looking for some dinner and a bed for the night. The visitors' bedrooms were in a guest house across the garden from the main building, as is normally the case in Kenya, and my hostess, while finding herself obliged to put him up, clearly felt somewhat uneasy on my behalf. I guess she had warned him to behave like a gentleman. When bedtime arrived, the two of us crossed the garden to our little guest house. Sure enough, after a pause, he called to me from his side of the door. "It's awfully cold, isn't it?" I called back. "I've got a rug in my car. Would you like it?" "No, thanks," came the disappointed reply. I was slightly unnerved by this, so I crept to the door and tried to turn the key without him hearing. But it would not turn. "It's no use trying to lock your door," he said. because I know it doesn't work. Would you like me to come and push the chest of drawers up against it? Over the following years, I got to know Raymond reasonably well and found he had a good side to him and was a well read and amusing companion. He was one of those people who could not bring himself to stop gambling, but he was not in the least embarrassed at the resulting failure to pay his debts. It was Christmas 1930, and it found me back at Capsulet, two more visitors' rooms newly added to the house, and the new year once more at Government House, this time with the recently appointed Sir Henry and Lady Moore as our host and hostess. It was the custom of Kenya to get up about 6 a.m. so as to make the most of the day before the oppressive heat set in. At Deloraine, I would often follow the game tracks up into the forest behind the farm, and thanks to this, I soon made friends with one of the Kenyan forest tribes, the Wandarobo. One of these tribes, Arap Lesse, particularly befriended me, and I acted as my guide. He showed me buffalo and other animals, and I would never have seen them otherwise, and even promised to take me to see the rarest woodland antelopes, an animal called the bongo. Teddy Brooke always wanted to shoot a bongo, so I wrote and told him to come along. He was delighted at the idea and hurriedly made plans to get the necessary shooting permit. News of this greatly upset the head of game warden, who hated people to go out on this kind of expedition unless he was along to help. When the day arrived, we often set up on foot with Marsley Truman, a nearby neighbor, a chaperone, and a dozen or more Africans to carry our camping equipment. Arap Lesse led us into the depths of the forest, where we pitched a camp by a spring in an open glade. Early the next morning, we left Marsley to spend a peaceful day with her knitting and a rifle in case buffalo should appear, and started to climb another 500 or 600 feet through the thick forest to the high and remote area frequented by the bongo. The camp was already above 8,000 feet, so the thinness of the air made the climb tiring. A difficulty was not mitigated by the need to keep very quiet, not to tread heavily on the mass of dry twigs that littered our path. At least we spied the bongo grazing amongst some bamboo. Teddy fired, and down she went. We both felt triumphant, but also sad to see the death of such a rare and beautiful creature. Arap Lesse skinned the beast there, right then and there. Teddy got his head, and I the covers for two large photograph albums. Having secured his bongo, Teddy soon returned home. In 1933, during my second stay, he and Prince Henry went big game hunting in Sudan, but they did not come on to Kenya. Prince Henry was never to visit the colony while I was there. Later that spring, I too left for home with Aunt Eileen and my two cousins. This time, according to my photograph album, we traveled in a French ship, but strangely, I can remember nothing of the voyage. Perhaps living for a year and a half at the height of 7,000 feet affects the memory. Early spring was the best possible moment in which to return to England. Friends and relations seemed glad to see me and hear about the darkest of Africa. As it was looked upon by many of them, I must have changed quite a bit and have gained self confidence from the experience and a greater knowledge of people and their ways of living and thinking. I lost no time in going to visit my sisters and special friends, who thoughtfully gathered others whom they knew would like to renew my acquaintance. Soon it was time to move to Scotland, for the summer holidays and the grouse shooting. Also to Teddy at Kinmount for some hilarious parties. I'm just about done with this part of chapter 8. But again, she went on 3 tours of Africa, and that's a lifetime experience. And she had quite an adventure. I could see where Prince William, the other Prince William, her oldest son, had an adventurous spirit. So I don't see that in Prince Richard. He's very, like, he's got a calmer demeanor, you know, and he's not ostentatious. He looks so much like Alice's father. But hearing that I had plans on my return to Kenya to make further expeditions to see wild animals in various remote districts, Teddy offered to lend me his cine camera, a novelty at that time. Needless to say, it was a very welcome offer. I saw little of Prince Henry. He was busy soldiering at Tidworth, and at the end of the summer got shingles, followed by an operation for an appendicitis. I saw him briefly while I was staying with Walter and his family in Eldon. He was with his brother, Prince George, the Duke of Kent. They had friends in Kenya and were interested to have the news of them. Before leaving at the end of October the 1st I was bridesmaid to May Cambridge and Henry Abel Smith. For this I stayed with Princess Alice and the Earl of Athlone at Brantbridge Park. The wedding took place in the village of Balcombe nearby. It was a great joy to see them all again, and such a happy occasion. I knew all the bridesmaids except Princess Ingrid of Sweden and Princess Silva of Coburg. Both of these charming people I was destined to meet once again when they were respectively the Queen of Denmark and Crown Princess of Sweden. But now I felt more than ready to return to the carefree existence of Africa. This time I was careful to stock up with painting materials, having found great satisfaction experimenting with watercolor. Yeah, you could see these are her paintings. So on her second trip, that's when she started to paint and sort of replicate her time in Africa. Amongst my fellow passengers on board the ship were Lord Furness with his son and daughter, who planned to go on a shooting safari below Isolo in the Lord's northern frontier. Hearing of my cinecamera, Lord Furness kindly asked me to join the party. When the time arrived, I set off with my faithful Kimani, stopping at night at Thompson Falls, where some acquaintances of mine had started a small hotel. To my disappointment, they had gone away for a week, leaving the place in care of a young assistant. He was largely occupied in trying, rather unsuccessfully, to make some Christmas cards to send home. So I lent him a hand, producing my box of watercolors and painting sprigs of holly and Christmas trees on pieces of notebook paper. He was most grateful for the help, and I sometimes wondered if he still is alive and remembers that evening, and if the cards were appreciated. I arrived safely in Camp Champagne, as it was and still is known. This lovely campsite beneath several large flat-topped thorns had been used on previous occasions by Lord Furness and appropriately named. Besides the Furness family, I found 3 friends of mine in the party. They all went shooting while I sketched or filmed, the scenery and the coloring being perfect for sketching, and 2 old rhinos obligingly turned up to be filmed. I am sure the young Furness son hated shooting the animals and only did so to please his father. 10 years later, he was killed in France, winning a posthumous V.C. The daughter, however, evidently did enjoy it as she later ran off with the white hunter. After the usual New Year festivities in Nairobi, I went on another safari for several weeks down south. A beautiful country then teeming with game of every kind, particularly near Amala and Mara River, a permanent source of drinking water for the animals. As beyond Aslo, one seldom saw another human being in the country except for an occasional native. Rich tourists with loud voices and purple hairdos now float above the scene in balloons while the ground is thick with minibuses. Back at the Lorraine, my friends, the Binghams, looked in one day with news that gold had been discovered near Kakamega, a district just north of Lake Victoria. They asked if I would like to join them, and a friend of theirs who'd pegged a claim always was ready for a new adventure. I accepted on the spot. To find the place proved more difficult than we had expected. When we asked locals the way, they just roared with laughter and said, Mazamungo Kopachimba, Swahili, for white man digging, evidently something they found very amusing. We eventually found a camp by the riverside, where we settled amongst our fellow prospectors, one of whom turned out to be Raymond de Trafford. For staking a claim, one had to pay a token fee for a piece of paper from the district's commissioner office, on which were entered name, address, and claim number. Then, all on one hand to do was to nail the paper to a post, stick it to the center of the designated piece of ground, and hope for the best. A friendly South African showed us how to toss the earth and gravel in the basin of water, chucking out the contents in intervals so the pieces of gold, being heavier than the rest, would remain behind till the final shake. I found one small nugget. While the Binghams went to Kisumu, a few hours' journey further on, to try to obtain an order for the cream and cheese they made on their farm, I and the friend went to investigate a claim belonging to a neighborhood to leave it to go away on farm business. It was a small stream off the main river, and we struggled on hands and knees as the undergrowth was very thick and came to a foot or so above the water. I went in front so as not to get branches flicking back into my face, and, on rounding the final bend, came face to face with three astonished, rather angry looking men. "What do you want?" one of them asked darkly. I explained that the claim belonged to a friend of mine. "No longer," replied another man with a nasty laugh. "Our claim is pegged here." So that was that. For me, it was one more memorable experience. I paid another visit 2 years later and found a small town had sprung up. In the evening, we went to a dance, the El Dorado, a noisy saloon where the prospectors collecting in the evenings. It was all very similar to the Wild West films. Being so happy in Kenya, I stayed till the middle of 1931 before finally driving myself back to England. Even this journey proved to be an adventure. Imperial Airways had just inaugurated their flying boat service to East Africa, and since it was a lot quicker and more exciting than going by ship, I booked myself on flight, on the second ever flight. First, however, there was a 2-month delay because the plane broke down, and then, only 2 days before we were due to leave, my pony put its foot in the pig hole, and I was thrown to the ground, and I broke my collarbone. The flight itself proved to be equally unlucky. Hardly had we left Uganda behind before we were forced to land on the Nile to avoid a dust storm. We could not sleep on the plane because of the danger of the mosquitoes, So one of the local fishermen was persuaded to take us ashore in his wobbly dugout tree of a boat. We were then transported in the back of a lorry to the nearest mission station. Carrying one arm in a sling had proved a great nuisance, and the on-call activity had also painfully inflamed my shoulder. So I ripped off the bandage and did without it till I reached Khartoum. There the bone was reset by a doctor who I was to meet again when visiting the hospital during the war. So, home again, I decided to stay for quite a while and eventually remained till the autumn of 1933. Disapproving of my visits to Kenya, my father warned me that if I was determined to go again, it would have to be at my own expense. This confronted me for the first time with the task of earning my own money, and I decided to hold an exhibition of my sketches. Paintings was not something that I had done much before I went to Kenya, but when I got there, I found myself taking it up simply because this, be, this being before the days of color photography, there was no other way of recording the coloring of the place. My sketching expeditions proved to be one of the most rewarding features of my Kenyan life. It was peaceful, it was instructive, and full of incidents. Monkeys were particularly mischievous. Once I left my paintings for a short time to take a roll and turned to find one holding my brush. He ran off, chattering excitedly, and climbed up a tree, and that was the last I saw of them. They were at their worst and most excitable if one was with a dog, and it was not unknown for monkeys to jump down in a gang on such an occasion. If we saw a dog unattended, and to attack, and sometimes even kill it. Another time I came face to face with a leopard. It was eating a buck it had just killed and looked at me with great surprise. I was not quite sure what to do, but I decided to walk backwards, staring at it and whistling The Road to the Isles. This display of Sagfroid succeeded and he galloped away. Alice faced lions and leopards. That was something else. Leopards, too, were known to go for dogs. It was even said that they would take one from inside the house, given the opportunity. But none of the animals had a reputation for attacking humans, and it was never thought the slightest bit dangerous for me to go out alone. I succeeded in fixing myself up with an exhibition of these Kenyan watercolors at Walker's Galleries in New Bond Street. I am sure the show met with much more kindly reviews than would be the case today. Even the Times gave me several column inches, including the compliment that in Africa the artist seems to have risen to the occasion and with imagination stimulated by unusual shapes and colors, she produced a series of records which are interesting pictorially as well as from the topographical point of view. I exhibited 64 pictures and sold 190 guineas worth of them at an average of about 5 guineas apiece. This was a great help to my finances. Only a week before, I had to travel from London to a party in Dumfriesshire by an overnight bus, simply because I could not afford to go by train. As it was my first time on such a coach, I was rather disconcerted when we stopped at intervals through the night at one pub or another. I don't think I'll bother to come out, thank you, I told my neighbors in an answer to their anxious invitations. Oh, but you must, they replied, looking at me in horror. I thought, oh dear, something awful must happen if one doesn't get out. So I got out, and I joined them for large meals washed down with tea in the all-night cafe. So that was quite an experience for Alice. I mean, these watercolors, you know, they that was her way of capturing the various different colors of Africa long before there was color photography. So, so interesting. I will go ahead and wrap this up because chapter 8 is long and I wanted to break it up into two parts.